Please note the meeting has gone live on YouTube.
I have a storm coming through with thunder and lightning and everything, so hopefully I stay on here. So if you lose me, that's why.
Leslie?
Yep.
Hi there.
Hello. Hey, we're gonna start right at 5. Just giving it a couple more minutes.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear us in headquarters?
Yes. Now I
Yes,
can.
Sounds like. All right, so headquarters is calling out for mic checks. Can everybody hear us?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Before it showed that you were muted, but now it shows you're not muted. Right. Could we, okay. We have a flag on the screen, but can the flag go to complete the screen so that we don't see everybody standing up or whatever, rather just have the flag on the screen? Is that possible?
Working on that, Chair.
Okay.
Can you hear us now?
Yes. Mhm.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Fabulous. Thank you. Yeah. Step 5.
Won't let you do that because it's going to show it's always.
Don't want me in the middle of you.
Chair,
Yes.
it sounds like on YouTube we can do just the flag, but we can't get there from here on Zoom.
Okay, you can't just like take over the screen and screen share that flag so that it's.
The screen share, it is being screen shared. The problem
Okay.
is Zoom doesn't allow you to get rid of the participants along with that screen share.
Okay. All right. We'll figure it out for
The
next.
flag is up.
Okay, got it. All right, if everyone could stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, I will call the meeting to order. I pledge allegiance to the flag
Flag.
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands,
Under God,
one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, thank you, everyone. And I guess I'm gonna let Deb run this meeting and we'll just start with her and then we can have questions as we go. So just a reminder, I have a storm coming through. So if I start getting a lot of thunder, I'm gonna mute just so I don't scare you guys. So I'll let you take over.
Gonna talk to you. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Vice Chair, Commissioners, Director. What we're going to do today is go through each of the recommendations, and my apologies to the work group members at being giving you instructions so recently on how we're going to handle this, but I know you're very familiar with this. And I don't think it should be that difficult since the commission already has heard the overview and in details and had these recommendations for 2 months now. So hopefully a quick brief overview from Dan Larson and Brian McGean. Again, my apologies for sending you the instructions today. And we'll have you guys go over those very briefly. And if you could in your presentations, please respond to the questions as appropriate from the commission that I sent you earlier. And then after the brief overview and the questions answered, if applicable, then we'll have the commission, if you have any questions, clarifying questions, any further questions, things that were considered, things that weren't considered, you could ask them of the work group, and then we'll do the same thing. We'll go through the recommendations in order, and we'll move on. The chair has requested 90 minutes for this meeting, so it's not going to be a long time per recommendation. So again, I ask that you guys be very concise in your answers and your responses and allow time for that interaction between the commissioners and the work group members. Does that anything not make sense?
Deb, it may make sense for, this is Commissioner Walsh. It may make sense for me just to give a very broad overview.
Sure.
Won't take more than a minute, and kind of
Sure.
how we got to where we are today. So
That would be great.
yeah, the work group was established by the prior commission in December of 2019. And I thought it'd be helpful just to go over the role and what the charge of this work group was. The work group was charged with developing recommendations to the commission for consideration regarding the allocation of commercial use trips to outfitters, a process to permit new outfitters on the Madison River, rule language to address all recreational use on the Madison River, including the walkway sections, and at that time, the proposed rest rotation proposal. And then the final item was consequences of permit violations. I think it's important to know what the work group was not charged with. We were not charged in any way with gathering public input. And while a number of outfitters attended our meetings, we did nothing really to gather public input or encourage the public to participate in our meetings. We also decided early in the process that we wouldn't weigh in on fishing regulations with respect to the Madison River. And then through counsel with Dustin Temple and others in the department, we discovered that we really couldn't impact fees of any kind or transfer tax or anything related to anything other than a minor administrative fee when it came to permits for non-commercial rec use or anything in the way of a fee related or tax related to the transfer of outfitter days. Both of those would need to run through the legislature. And, you know, we have had, the group had 9 or 10 meetings in total, but then we broke out into subgroups to meet on these specific topics, really on the commercial use cap and on the non-commercial recreational use cap. And Allison Treelor also worked on the process to permit new outfitters to get outfitted on the Madison River, or at least some economic entry point for new outfitters to the area. And that's what resulted in the proposals that came to the commission in June. And so with that, I think I'll turn it over to, I think Dan Larson is ready to go first. If he's not muted.
There, I think I unmuted myself. Deb, could you just clarify when you refer to our recommendations, what document are you working off of? Because we've got, I'm not sure I tie in exactly, and I want to make sure I'm responsive to what you view as the recommendations.
So for each of the, we have 6 documents, I believe here. Is it 6 or 5? it's 6 documents. So we were going to go in the order of what Jasmine had sent out to everybody. So we're gonna start with this, and if you guys decide to do it differently, that's fine. But I have the commercial management proposals. So I was going to start with that document.
And is
Does that
that,
make sense?
is that the June 1st, 2022
It is.
document?
It
Okay.
is. It
All right.
is.
Okay,
Mhm.
great. Hopefully, in many ways, that document sort of speaks for itself and takes you through the specific recommendations and the summary there. I was more interested in potentially taking you out of the trees up to maybe a drone view of the issues, particularly as it's been raised with some of the questions that were submitted to us later this afternoon, that raised questions of why are we doing this, and what's the interface between commercial regulation and non-commercial regulation? Why would the commercial regulation be interested in going forward with caps and the various issues that we have there? And then the what I would call sort of the transferability question and the implications of that on financials and economics. And then the question regarding seasonal versus and geographical limitations, why not daily limitations in that, rather than going through each individual recommendation. Does that make sense, or I can switch around?
I think that makes sense to me. Chair, are you okay with that? Chair Robinson?
Yes, that's fine. Yes.
Okay, and I think by doing that, we will be able to answer and get into the specific recommendations, but that way make sure that we get the big picture questions that we saw coming out of the commission questions that were submitted to us late today. You're probably familiar, this is a river that's the most loved river in the state. It has had perceived social issues, conflict questions off and on for a number of years, the concern regarding potential overuse, the long history of attempts and failed attempts at regulations here. Where we're at today is very different than I think the commercial community and in general the community was 3 to 5 years ago. And you're going to hear that in terms of what we picked up through this work group, the outfitters and the businesses related to the fishing industry being very supportive of moving forward with some commercial regulations. At the same time, recognizing that the 800-pound gorilla is the non-commercial use, which by many of the statistics is 85% of the river usage. It fluctuates at different times. You have the most detailed information on the commercial side of things because of the SRP process, down to the granular of each individual day of launches by the 140 some SRP holders. On the non-commercial side, you have significantly less detailed data. And that's going to be one of the cruxes that you struggle with and we struggled with through this process. Addressing some of the perceived social issues, two of the things that the work group did very quickly was to identify that like 70% of the perceived issues by the surveys of FWP are at the fishing access sites or within a half mile when all the traffic and congestion is. So a fishing ambassador site program is being implemented this year. And there's a series of fishing access site improvements that are in the works of going through engineering and funding and various things. Also, as Commissioner Walsh pointed out, we didn't address the fisheries question. We were presented with information, but no conclusions from FWP staff of what the fishery status is. I think in all of our minds, that's a wide open category for ongoing management as you see fit, as you would any other river on the management for the fishery itself. one of the things with this overview of where we at commercial, non-commercial, as you will see, and Brian will talk about, is the recommendation for a river management plan to be developed, which would encompass non-commercial usage. And that will be a separate set of discussions, and how that gets kicked off or what it all entails is a fairly extensive discussion. Let me just go to the commercial side of things. And I think one of the questions that came up from the commissioners was, why would the commercial industry be interested in doing this? And the recurring theme that we heard was a concern regarding protection of the quality of the experience on the Madison River and a protection of the quality of the fishery. And those were sort of overriding concerns. And then I think, again, 3 to 5 years ago, you would not have found the commercial fishing industry in the lead in terms of caps. They've come around dramatically and are really kind of leading by example for what may become a broader comprehensive management system on the Madison River. The program that we suggested is a new permit, and that's to take advantage of the legislative change that was made in the last legislative session for transferability. And more importantly, it was tied into a flexible permitting system, transferable, opens up new opportunities for new outfitters to come in. It doesn't cap the number of outfitters or who those can be or how their businesses might be able to grow or not grow or shrink. It avoids the liquor license perception of creating a captive value, and it incorporates use it or lose it provisions to try to maintain the commercial viability for the communities there, and again to avoid some of the traps that the BH2 allocation system, where it's an all or nothing system, has created values that are perceived to be distorted and somewhat anti-competitive. We've given you some economic analysis of how we broke that out. You've got one of the documents that Allison took the lead on in terms of new entry opportunities, and that flexibility of being able to transfer use days among permitted users hopefully keeps it flexible, keeps it controlled, doesn't allow the values to get out of line. So, and one other thing is that we do not suggest restricting qualified outfitters from getting an SRP or from getting a river use permit. And those systems, I think the SRP is $100 or $200 a year, and whatever the river use permit might have for an allocation cost there, but that'd be unlimited. And then within that, you'd work within the cap, the number of days that are available, and whether you have them historically, or you could acquire them either on a short-term or a long-term basis. And then one other high-level question that came up there is, why not a seasonal cap, a daily cap? Are you accomplishing anything by placing one total cap on the commercial usage? And this is one of the most hotly contested, debated, researched issues that our work group, but particularly the subgroup that I chaired, went through. And I can tell you the very first meeting, I had two outfitter related interests at the opposite ends of my kitchen table, standing up and yelling and disagreeing. And 8 meetings later, we'd all reached a consensus and an agreement based on digging into the data, looking over things, talking about business plans and various things to come up with the recommendation that we did. We also put some of those options for seasonality or geographical limitations, or even daily or weekly limitations, into the adaptive management plan if some of the assumptions we make are wrong. The primary assumption that we worked off of, and the historical data that is also included in your June 22nd commission package. When you look at particularly the upper river, which is the bulk of the usage, I think 85% of the commercial usage is on the upper river. It is a bell curve that peaks in July. And it's been a bell curve that peaks in July and almost the exact same model from the edges for the last 10 years. From low usage to the peak usage that you've just seen in the last couple of years. And that was one of the factors that drove us, as we were looking at it, to have a permit system that worked, that was flexible, that didn't overwhelm either outfitters or staff in management. And then thinking about the business models, if you want to say, of the users of the river, it doesn't make sense for everyone to dive in and all the days that are allocated become used in a 4-week period. Our businesses don't work that way. We need 6 or 8 months of really healthy business usage. And again, that's that bell curve. It's there, it goes up, it comes down based on overall usage, but it hasn't changed dramatically. And that was probably the biggest factor for why we didn't go to a more limited system that would get into more complications on a permitting side and a user side. That's sort of a high-level summary. I'll shut up and any questions. And then we've identified individuals from our work group to help me out on specific questions that might come up. So I may refer some of those to Brian or Mike or Rich here.
Thanks, Dan. I guess I would ask the commission if you had questions, if he didn't answer clearly one of the questions that you've already posed. Does anybody have any clarifying questions or additional questions for Dan and other members of the work group? You did a good job, Dan, it looks like.
Boy, leave them speechless.
So Deb, if you just want to proceed with what you've got.
Sure. Thank you, Chair. Who would be up next? Would that still be you, Dan, or are you going to Brian for?
I would recommend that we go to Brian for an overview on the non-commercial regulatory proposals or recommendations. And so you get that sense, because it ties in very closely. Brian?
Okay, Brian.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I'm actually gonna follow Dan with, there is one other commercial recommendation, although our non-commercial group took the lead on it. And that is the recommendation titled Madison River Commercial Watercraft Rental Delivery Permit. Dan commented that a majority of the guided trips occur on the upper river, but there's also a substantial commercial business for unguided trips. That's primarily tubing on the bottom half of the river. And so typically the businesses, there's really just one large business, and then two businesses use smaller use. They meet people, their guests at the river, rent them tubes, pick them up at the bottom, and sometimes they transport them to and from the river. We have some data on that level of use, but it's not as crisp as it is for the guided trips. So there's a recommendation there to require, they're currently permitted at the moment, but they operate under a shuttle permit. So we recommend using the same permitting system, but having those businesses have a specific permit that records their usage of how many watercraft they're renting to users, with the intention that at a later date, there may be some maximum limitations on how many they can rent per season. So that is the recommendation is currently a specific permit for those businesses, record better data, and then when a comprehensive plan is developed, that we consider some potential limits there. The next set of recommendations is a Madison River non-commercial set of recommendations. And this is modeled after many other rivers in other states that have faced similar challenges of concerns of overuse. And so this is essentially three tiered set of recommendations. The first is to improve the current level of passive data collection. This is important because it's used as a benchmark to monitor the river's use in the future. It's also important to note that passive monitoring is very difficult to actually count the number of boats on the river in a single day for non-commercial users. But some of the existing data that we have, like the number of cars in and out of access points with cameras, is very good. There's been some smaller data sets using cameras to count boats on the river, but we would recommend a little bit more elaborate baseline data through passive. It's a little premature to set river capacities for non-commercial users because we don't have crisp enough data on all parts of the river. We also don't have the tool in how we would set maximum limits on non-commercial use. So the second recommendation is to require a daily float permit for users. Commercial operators are already permitted, but to add a required day permit, this is very common in many other rivers. Typically, users go to a website like recreation.gov. They might go to the Pine or the Pere Marquette River in Michigan, click a day, click a permit. They pay like $5, issue that permit. When they're floating down the river, it's not a hang tag. They just have to have a copy of that permit for their floating party. And that's required. So we would recommend that. And that would also allow us to gather better data on the amount of watercraft floating down the river. So these would be required. Our recommendation is only for floating parties, but not for not for folks that want to go out and men and women want to go out and lead fish. And then finally, a commitment to develop a comprehensive recreation plan that would address non-commercial use after 2 years of data collection through river permits and the passive system. And that may at that point require some limits, maximum use limits. We would recommend that for non-commercial users. There's another set of recommendations, which is titled Madison River Recreation Recommendations on Vessel Requirements for the Upper River. This, in a nutshell, is to address the growing usage of watercraft that are under no power, very limited navigational power. For example, inner tubes. They're becoming more common as the town of Ennis grows in population. We're seeing more tubes on the upper part of the river. That's the most popular with the float fishing year round. And the concern is those users, it's a kind of recipe for conflict if someone, is trying to control their boat and fish from a boat, or maybe they're stopped and they're anchored. And if a floating group under no navigational control comes down and bounces off other boats, it creates some conflict. So the recommendation would be a requirement, much like on other fisheries, we require that maybe there be horsepower limits, or there might be, you may not be able to use a motor on certain requirements. We recommend that on much of the upper river, with the exception of the 8 Mile to Valley Garden section, if you're going to float that river, you need to be in a vessel that would have adequate navigational capabilities like oars or a paddle. So that is that recommendation. And that's simply for the upper river. That would not apply to the lower river, where it's broader and gentler. Even folks in tubes can sometimes stand up and walk around a hazard or another boat. The final non-commercial recommendation is really a handoff to the Bureau of Land Management. but that is to recognize that in the Bear Trap Canyon Wilderness area, there are conflicts that occur specifically when folks launch. It's not a place where you trailer boats up and drop them off. It's a whitewater run with a Class 5 rapid. So folks bring rafts and kayaks, and they're often spending up to a half an hour rigging to run those rapids. And if multiple parties show up at the same time, there's no place to stage or park. It causes a lot of frustration when that does happen. So our recommendation is that there be a permit possibly administered through the BLM that would be required to float there, and that those permits may be staggered by time to just spread people out when they go to float that wilderness area. And that is the end of the summary of the non-commercial recommendations.
I have a quick question. So this is Leslie. For the permits for the non-recreational use, is that something that other states can do, like on their smartphones?
Yeah,
have a copy through their phone rather than a copy?
I believe they're just like we're able to. I believe that is the case, that it's acceptable to have it on your phone, just like we do with our fishing licenses. And they're pretty simple. I mean, you go and you pick your day, you send how many people are going to be in your party, how many boats you're going to have, and you push print. And then it is required that you have that. We've talked extensively with river recreation managers in Michigan, in Oregon. How do people follow the rules? For example, do you have to increase your level of enforcement? And the feedback we have is, after a year or two, it's mainly an education issue that people need to be aware that they're required to have these, but the compliance is extremely high. I've heard it be equated to fishing licenses. I've only, even though I'm on the river often, I've only been checked for a fishing license once in the last 4 or 5 years, but everybody I know that fishes has a license. And once people, know that it's required, the compliance is high. Enforcement budgets did not increase. It's the same check, when they're out checking licenses, they'll ask if folks have a floater permit.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? All right. Deb, if you want to move on to the next one.
Sure. I think the last one, and I'm not sure, I know this belonged to somebody else in the group. They were the lead on it, but can somebody, I don't know who was going to address the new entry for river service providers? Was
I think
Dan
Dan's-
or?
Dan,
I'll
Dan's-
take it. Yeah. Make sure I'm unmuted here. Allison Treeler, who wasn't able to join us tonight with the change of schedule, took the lead, but it was also an integrated part of the discussion that the commercial subgroup focused on. And there is a document that is in your package from our June 22nd commission meeting. It's called Opportunities for New Entry for River Service Providers, that summarizes some of the issues there as well. I'll just try to hit a few of the highlights there. What we were looking at is not to create a limit on who could qualify as an outfitter on the river. And I use outfitter, we really should reuse the word river service provider, because it does cover non-outfitting businesses as well. There are some that are sightseeing or various things, but if I use outfitter, please think of it as river service provider. So no change. Our recommendation is no change in the joint BLM FWP special river or special recreation permit, the SRP, that is the ticket to operate on the Madison River commercially. And as I said earlier, I think the cost of that is $100 and something a year that you can get that. If you're a qualified outfitter, you can purchase your SRP. The special river use permit, that would be a Montana designated permit. We're not suggesting whatever fee, if there's some administrative fee that the commission needs to charge, but we don't view that as being a gateway or a barrier to entry. And then it's a matter of a new outfitter being able to acquire either by leasing on a short-term basis or a purchase on a long-term basis, use days from somebody who is not using those days. And we tied it in with a use it or lose it provision to try to create an incentive for either those days get used or they get transferred to somebody. And we've done, various analysis trying to figure out what some of the valuations are. Again, there's an economic analysis in that June package for you that looks at what that might be and how various outfitters would look at the value of acquiring a day. We contrasted this with other systems, trying to avoid the liquor license, somewhat monopolistic limitation. We tried to minimize some of the drawbacks that have been learned from the BH2, Beaverhead Big Hole regulatory system that capped the number of providers, and it became sort of an all or nothing. So you sell your license and you get access to peak days as well as and unlimited non-peak days. And the value of those licenses has gone up dramatically, and the number of providers has dropped in half since that was instituted. We didn't see that as conducive here. We wanted a system that allows people to get in to the business, get access onto the river, create flexibility, and keep a vibrant fishing community for the communities of Ennis and West Yellowstone and Bozeman.
Any questions?
Question? Boy, I'm just leaving you speechless here, so, okay.
Seeing none, Chair Robinson, if you don't mind, maybe I will walk through the questions that the commission posed just to make sure that they were answered satisfactorily for you guys. Would
That would be
work?
great. That would be great. Thank you. Oh, I think Commissioner Byerth, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just curious. I hadn't seen those questions come up till this afternoon. And I was just curious as to where the commission questions came from. I wasn't polled, so I didn't get a chance to weigh in, but I was just curious.
Deb, did you want to? That?
I received them from the commission yesterday.
I think Commissioner Tabor, I visited with him and we spoke about some questions and put those together, but they're not limited if there's more questions, but let's go through the questions that were sent to him just to make sure that everything was covered and it's not stopping us from having more questions.
Yeah, I think we'll have plenty of time, Chair Robinson and commissioners, to go over any questions that you have, but I'll just walk through these just to make sure that I think some of the answers were a little bit, they were included in your presentation, but I don't know that they were clearly answered. So I'll walk through these, and Dan and Brian, if you want to take a first shot, and maybe Commissioner Walsh and other work group members can join in, but I'll just go through these one at a time. The first question was, the commercial cap recommendation sets an overall cap on use days in a given year, but doesn't appear to actually cap use on any given day, week, or season. Therefore, it appears that the commercial cap proposal won't actually do anything to curtail use or overcrowding in any specific period. Given the expense associated with the creation of the system, as well as the ongoing maintenance and reporting, what actual benefits to the public does this new system bring about?
And trying to just summarize again, this goes to that seasonality question that we really debated heatedly at first, in depth, with a lot of data looking at business models. And also looking at the feasibility if we were to do seasonal cap and a non-season what that might do for the flexibility of the permitting system, the complexity of the permitting system. The benefit for the public, which is probably your biggest question there, is that it does set a cap. Using the best of 2019 and 20 would have been a cap of around 16,200 some trips. Historically, the highest use year was like 14,400 some trips. Last year, 2021 was over 18,000 trips. Now, given the potential deferral of when your cap goes into place, you may need to revisit what years become the base or how the allocation goes, because the further that gets into the rearview mirror, you've got equity issues that I think need to be addressed. We have not tried to address those yet as a work group in any way. But it would place a cap on the commercial usage. And we believe it, if you look at that bell curve that historically has been there, and our adaptive management recommendation, there should be it's a limitation on the commercial use.
Okay, I think the one part of the question was, though, it doesn't really limit a certain time period. So it's for the season, but it's not going to really necessarily help for if there's periods where there is way higher traffic. I think that's how I interpret that question, I guess.
Sure, Robin.
Commissioner Walsh.
Yeah, if I may, I just add, I think this is one of those topics that was debated in both the subgroup and also in the Madison River Work Group. And I think there's a very large assumption here, and that is if you don't, don't cap this, say, July dates or the July period or the entire peak period, that there's a risk that that there'll be some transfer of outfitter days in October, November, which historically are not very marketable to out-of-state visitors, that those could easily be taken then into July and compound the problem in the peak of the season. And I'm not sure, it's just a large assumption that the subgroup made, and that the assumption is those periods are already crowded. We already have trips being canceled or moved around because visitors don't enjoy those peak periods as much as they do the shoulders. And there was a high level of concern that the shoulder seasons would then grow if they were uncapped or left with lower restrictions, that they would grow. Now, I'd add I think a fair criticism is if you're in the business of selling outfitter days, the current proposal would maximize the return to those who have historic use days. And that, I'd just say that's a fair criticism, because there are very, very few restrictions on how those days, once transferred, can be used. So I think this is a fair question.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I don't see the questions as criticism either, just more helping us understand.
This literally was probably the most debated issue through several months of weekly meetings.
Okay, thank you.
And Chair, I might, this is Brian McKee, I might chime in on that as an outfitter. So I think the consensus from many of my colleagues on this topic, in our operations, we are limited. We turn trips away almost every day of the peak season because we have a finite number of guides that we have relationships with. And in order to bring fishing guides to work for your business as an outfitter, you need to be able to get them a certain number of days in order for them to make it as a profession. And so, if you've been historically running 300 trips per year, you have a few guides that work for you. They all need 100 days or more in order to pay their mortgage, make a living at it. And so it's very, very difficult to if you have a limit of your historical use, you've run 300 trips, 300 trips, 300 trips, and now that's how many you can run. It's extremely difficult to try to load those into July, for example, because you simply don't have the guides. And that would mean that you now have no work for your core guides in the shoulders. And really, in my mind, what would happen is actually you would pull from the peak and go, you'd try to spread the work out a little more to have a more stable guide base. So there's also, it's really important to many of us as outfitters to have a little bit of wiggle room in order, if we do have a big group, we want to be able to cater that group on a given day. And we recognize we might not be able to then sell a group 2 weeks later. The other really big one is what is the alternative? And if you look at a concession model where you have a permit and now you limit the number of permittees and you say, hey, we're going to box everybody out. No one's allowed into the system anymore. Well, right now there's 140 permittees. Most of them run very few trips. They're from Missoula, or they're from Columbus, Montana, or Livingston. There's a handful of, less than 20 outfitters that over 85% of the trips are operated. And these are fly shops and lodges in the valley or close to the valley. And the reality is, if you try to use like a daily metric, you'd have to set that metric really, really high in order for the large outfitters to conduct their current businesses. And what that means is then every other permit, might be able to run 17 trips a day, and you effectively don't set any limits that way. And it can keep growing and growing and growing. So that's sort of the reality. And then you create that liquor license model that every permit can run a lot of trips. And so the guy that comes, in Columbus, Montana, that's only ever run a single trip on the Madison in his life, now could possibly sell that to someone wanting to open a lodge, and that permit would be, possibly allow hundreds or thousands of trips to be operated. That was the concerns with one of the iterations that came through in 2017. So lots of nuances there, but that's one of the reasons we looked at all those different alternatives and settled on this as a simple system. It's very easy to report, and it would be effective.
Okay, Commissioner.
Chair Robinson,
Who's speaking?
Mike Bias, Fishing
Okay.
Outfitters Association.
One of the, hold on a second. I think Commissioner Byerth has a question, so let me
Okay.
ask that and then I'll go back to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess this is for Brian, or Mike can pitch in too, as professional outfitters. My question relates to the bell curve and the reason the bell curve is there. And I looked over the data over the last several years that was provided, and it seems like it's pretty solid. We've had kind of a land office rush during the interim as we've been trying to hammer out the issue. Why isn't the shoulder season more abundant, or why don't we see growth? And I mean, just knowing, because I use the Madison myself, it's got to be related to weather, flow conditions. There's all sorts of reasons that you don't have 1,000 trips in April or May.
Commissioner Bioworth, there's interestingly in this last previous season, which is the highest demand we've ever seen as COVID travel was returning and everybody had stimulus money in their pocket and wanted, had quarantine the year before. And so we had unprecedented demand. And what we saw was that normal bell curve, actually, the peak really didn't grow, but it grew in the shoulders. The reason the peak didn't grow is we didn't have guides. We all ran out of guides.
And we don't have hotel rooms or capacity in that.
Yeah, our lodges were full. We didn't have many guides left to sell. We could have sold triple the number of trips in July if we had the guides, but we were able to maximize our shoulders, and the whole thing lifted like this. There's another really important thing to understand about the Madison River and many other rivers is the river is not identical in April and May and June and July. There's very low flows in the shoulders. That's also when fish spawn. You simply can't, what would feel non-crowded with two boats floating on the same stretch, sort of side by side in July, when they each have a bank and it's a wide river. That's different in October when the river's compressed and there's less water. Now the boats have to kind of go single file. So you simply can't have the same number of boats on the river without really upsetting people, in July compared to October. And just in terms of the way that it's like going from a 2-lane highway in June and July and August when you have a lot of water down to a 1-lane road in the shoulders.
So Mike, did you want to speak to that?
Thank you, Chair Robinson. There's Brian touched on some of this, but there is in fact a case study, and it's the Beaverhead Big Hole model is managed managed based on seasonality. And when I looked at the last 12 years of available data from both the Beaverhead and the Big Hole, and on the Beaverhead, for example, is managed only or limited, restricted only in July and August. And trips during that time have decreased, whereas trips on the shoulder season outside of that restricted period have increased almost by 2 times. So take a seasonality approach, it puts more pressure on the shoulder seasons, or has the potential to increase use on the shoulders. And from a spawning fish conservation angle, we felt maybe not get into the micromanaging of outfitter trips based on shoulders. The other thing is that it comes this liquor license idea, or the cost of an overall permit. If you manage a person's permit only in say July, and allow them unlimited trips, that automatically would create a large demand for permits, and subsequently increase costs, which we've seen on the Beaverhead and Big Hole. For example, a 1-day permit, you can have a 1-day trip in July or August, but you're unlimited outside that time in the shoulder seasons. People are spending a lot of money for Beaverhead, Big Hole permits because of that. They have opportunity to guide outside that limited time frame. That was pretty much it. That we had the case study of the Beaverhead Big Hole and seasonality, seasons spawning. Go ahead, Dan.
If I could just add, and I know Mac Menard, when we were meeting earlier this week in preparation for this, said I could share his name on this one, but Mac, myself, I think John Sampson was a member of our subgroup. All of us came into this process thinking that seasonality would be an integrated part of it. And after all of our research and everything, all of us came around to agreeing on the proposal that's before you, subject to the caveat that Commissioner Walsh mentioned, is that if our assumptions are wrong, we included this as an adaptive management recommendation for something to be reviewed periodically and could be a future regulatory limit if our assumptions are wrong.
Commissioner Walsh.
Thanks, Chair Robinson. Dan, I think it might be helpful also to just summarize what we heard from Zach Brown and other members of the non-outfitting community who really value the lower traffic during the shoulders, and kind of I think argued that they didn't want to do anything that would increase traffic of commercial users during the shoulder season.
Let me just pick that up, because one of the models that we looked at was to place a seasonal cap. We were thinking from June 15th until the end of September, and that would be the commercial cap based on historical usage. And the shoulder season would be either unlimited for growth, or we talked about would there be some triggers of growth over the current historical usage. It gets far more complex when you start breaking that out, how to manage the shoulder growth. But we also got huge pushback from the somewhat the commercial usage, but certainly from the non-commercial members of the work group, that the shoulder season is sort of the locals' time. I fish more in April and May and in October than I do during the height of the summer season. And lots of other people weighed in on the same way. And so keeping that from potentially growing too dramatically. And again, we go back then, you place one annual cap based on historical usage or whatever number you end up with. And that bell curve from a business model, we think will keep the bell curve much the same.
Okay, so I think we have more questions to cover and we have a half an hour left, so we better move on. Deb, if you want to go to the next one.
Sure,
Please.
thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair Robinson. The next question is from the commission. If the broader concept that the Madison River has reached a point that some form of maximum daily usage cap is necessary for social management purposes, not biological as addressed below, why did the group seemingly focus solely on commercial use other than the ARM mandates imposed by prior commission? It seems that it will be necessary to address non-commercial use of the Madison more so, given that the level of use, because it is the greatest share. Without addressing non-commercial on an implementation schedule simultaneous to the advent of commercial caps, then we really haven't addressed the real source of crowding. So the question in there is, why did the group focus on commercial use other than mandates imposed by the prior commission?
I guess I'm just going to jump in that Brian did speak about that, and I think to track it, to really truly know what the non-commercial use was, I think that there would have to be some kind of tracking on that, I guess. Am I correct in what was said? And do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, that's accurate. We discussed trying to set capacities for non-commercial, floating use now. And we have some metrics. We have some reaches of the river where we can look at ratios and camera counts. We know how many get it, but we have other areas where we just don't have the data. We would really be guessing on how many boats are in certain areas on non-commercial. I'll tell you, we also did a lot of focus groups. We met with like boards of like Trout Unlimited, NS Chamber of Commerce, went out and talked within the community, and the general public. They're expecting something that would include the general public, but I think it's really important to members of the general public that don't have a commercial interest. They're not guys who are out there. They don't have a lodge, that they want to see commercial be addressed. And so they both need to happen. We can address commercial now or very soon. And I think that will also go a long way. We do need a commitment on non-commercial. Bozeman is growing. It's the fastest growing city in the country. But that is, hopefully it kind of answered your question. I think it's important mechanically, but it's also important from the gaining acceptance and buy-in from the general public.
If I could just add, I believe there is a fairly strong feeling among the commercial side of the business that while they are taking the lead in proposing regulations and caps on their usage, it is equally important to take steps towards management of the non-recreational use. That is the 800-pound gorilla. And our recommendation heading towards a river management plan that would address that.
Okay, Mike, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, Chair Robinson, thank you. And following on Dan and Brian's points, there is a historical component to this too, in that the SRP program was implemented 2007, 8, and 9. So we've been operating, commercial users have been operating under a permit system like the SRP and with associated reporting requirements. So we know the ins and outs of commercial use on the Madison, probably like no other river except the Beaverhead Big Hole. And so there's a mechanism for fees and for permits and for days and reporting already in place. And there's really none of that in the non-commercial sector, nor is there accurate count data. It's all estimates. So we figured the best first step in managing or looking to manage non-commercial is finding out what the numbers are prior to going in. Thanks.
Thank you. Deb, would you like to go to the next question, please?
Sure. And in this one, I believe Dan and Brian addressed this, but I'll read it just in case there's follow-up questions or you need something more. Question 3 from the commission: commercial caps on use days or access is a hotly debated topic among a variety of agency permitting entities due to the long-term financial impact it has on permittees. For instance, caps in good years equate to a permanent ceiling placed on the maximum revenue a provider can generate in a life cycle of business. However, in recreation provision on natural resources, there are ample reasons where maximum revenue won't be achieved due to Mother Nature's impact. Examples include late snow, drought, flood, fire, etc. Additionally, the overall economy can have a profound impact on the revenue flow, especially on a cyclical basis. The entire state is seeing signs of that this year. Why would any commercial group of providers want to agree to a ceiling cap when there are so many scenarios that make it more likely than not that the majority of the revenues over the years will result in a downward pressure on revenues? In a non-capped environment, the high years help offset the low years so that over the course of time, the recreation provider has a fair chance to earn a reasonable return on their investment.
Would any of you like to add to what you've already given us for information on that subject?
Chair Robinson, I could add a little bit, and it's interesting. It's the makeup of the outfitters. For example, there's roughly 250 permitted outfitters on the Madison, and 50% of those, so 125 outfitters, are doing only 25 trips a year or less. 85% of those, so 175, 180 outfitters, are doing 100 days or less. So if historically going into it, if you only have 25 days and you're spreading those out throughout the year, it's outfitters, for example, coming from out of area, we call them Twin Bridges, for example, over here, or even Dillon, aren't gonna climb to the 300 trips a year aspect anyway. That's not in their model. So, and then them willing to allow a cap that would preserve as best we could the experience that people have when they fish the Madison. It's an awesome river. They're agreeable to doing that. And that's what we found in all our scoping.
Okay, thank you. Any other, before we go on to the next question? Okay, go ahead, Deb, thank you.
Chair, again, I think this was touched on, but if there are any follow-ups or additional comments. Number 4 from the commission is the suggested commercial system creates a limited participant concept for commercial operators, which by its nature does not favor new entrants into the service provision. This has often been referred to as the liquor license syndrome. A couple of questions. A, can a purposely low amount be dictated by the creation of permits such as $1 per user day? It seems the only reason separate permits are being created is due to the prohibition of limiting numbers of permittees. By assigning a low dollar amount to the permits, the barrier to entry of the cost to start up of a business is removed. And B, how does the creation of a permit system that will establish an overall market value in excess of $20 million in a tradable, sellable commodity benefit the public or create better social management of the river? This has been referred to as monetization of the permit system with no apparent benefit to the public or non-commercial user of the resource.
Would any of you, Dan, go ahead.
I was maybe first ask if there are any more specific questions. Otherwise, I'd just kind of hit a little bit of a summary on that one, if I could.
Sure. Why don't you just go ahead with your summary?
All right. First, I wanted to make sure we understand the number of permittees, if you want to say as operators, we're not suggesting any limitation on. The SRP process remains open for any qualified outfitter to acquire. Same thing with the river use permit. If you have the outfitting and you have your SRP, you could be a river use provider under this Montana regulation. And then it's utilizing the legislative authority that was approved there for transferability, and having that transferability be tied to the use day on transferring either on a short term or a longer term, and trying to keep that value as flexible, and then the use it or lose it so that it doesn't become an artificially inflated value or an asset that somebody's setting aside and not using. And that's key to easing the entry for new people and for maintaining the commercial use on the river that supports all the businesses up and down the corridor there.
Can I just ask a quick question? So the use it or lose it, if you do lose it, then those become available for the new ones coming in. Is that correct? Or
correct? And our recommendation, and obviously subject to modification, was that those would be back into a pool with a preference given to new outfitters, new people coming in. Otherwise it'd be allocated out. But we want those from a business perspective in the community, like Ennis and other places, we want the river to be used. So not to be tucked away into somebody's back pocket.
Okay.
The other perception that I wanted to address is the question of, are we creating new value by a transferable tradable permit? And there's, if this is a $15 to $25 million, if they were all sold at the valuation that we kind of went through, does that represent new value? Today, if let's take a fly shop that runs 500 trips a year on the Madison River, if they sell their business, part of the value of that business is the intangible of their customer list, their relationship with guides, somewhat their physical facility, and their usage on the river there, where they're located. And now all those things are going to go into the value of their business. If you have this new regulatory scheme there, you probably are just allocating part of that value that business would get today. And it might be a little incremental because it's now part of a capped limited access limitation there. But still part of that value is the historical customers that come, the guides that you're connected to. So it's not all new value. It's probably a shifting around of some of the valuations that take place in a business, and then some creation of new because of the commercial cap. And our question that we kept struggling with is, what alternative is there if you want to limit the commercial usage? What other system works better to maintain flexibility, maintain ease of entry? The concession model we discussed, and with 140 users, wouldn't be feasible for FWP staff to manage. So we keep coming back to that.
Okay, Commissioner Byarth has a question, so let me have him jump in, please.
Thanks, Chair. I guess this was for Dr. Bias. Mike, about three and a half years ago, we were discussing a lot of this when the petitions were coming out from both FOAM and some other angler groups and Madison River Foundation. And one of the things that you researched was how trips are traded and tend to, over time, tend to decrease in numbers. Could you talk about what you found in your research, and then how this proposal addresses that? I think it gets to some of these sub-questions in question number 4.
Yeah. Thanks, Commissioner Byarth. There's kind of two parts to that. One is looking at the Beaverhead Bait Hole as the model, and in that model, in that permit system, the first thing they did was put a moratorium on new outfitters, and the other thing that happens as as many of you may know as commissioners, the prior to last year, there was no ability in permit systems to break up your permit and sell partial days, or when you got out of the business, you had to give up your amount of days in its entirety. And a purchasing outfitter, or if an outfitter acquired 2 permits, those days were combined, those amount of trips were combined. And say he acquired a 100-day permit and a 100-day permit, he would now have a 200-day permit. And what happened over time is on the Beaverhead Big Hole, it was implemented in about the year 2000. They started out with 80 some permittees, 180 some outfitters, and that number has since declined to under 150 because of this combining of permit days and inability to transfer among permits. The other thing that happened in that model, and I touched on this earlier, was that because the permit time frame is July and August on the Beaverhead and June and July on the Big Hole, the actual amount of use during those permitted times has decreased from in around rivers to 67% decline on the Big Hole and about a 40% decline in user days on the Beaverhead. So instead of running 5,000 days through the peak season, you're running 3,100 on the Beaverhead and less than that, about 2,000 on the Big Hole. So use has actually declined, which some people would say, oh, wow, it's working great, except the number of outfitters on both of those rivers has declined by almost 40%. I think that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. I think, let's go, is there one more question, Deb? I think I've lost track.
There are 2 more questions, but
Okay,
I think this
let's
next
go.
one will be a quick one.
Okay,
This one Dan addressed, I believe. Question 5, several opponents of the proposals have indicated that this plan does not fully address the crowding issues or offers any substantive biological protections to the fishery. The department has indicated that these particular recommendations would not likely be proposed by the department versus developing a prioritized spectrum of policies that directly applies to fisheries management and conservative regulations, e.g., lure modifications, catch and release, hook size, barbing requirements, and temporal and geographical spawning season closures. How does the committee see these proposals addressing biological concerns as being better than the traditional means by which the department would approach doing so?
I might just answer that quickly. I tried to address it at the beginning of the meeting, but we decided early on that those were beyond the scope of the work group, along with Dr. Rice, who was attending our meetings in that time frame. So we did not approach this with respect to fishing regs at all.
okay,
Um,
thank,
Chair Robinson,
yes.
on that question too, I can say, although we didn't look at it through biological fishing regulations, the idea that it doesn't fully address crowding issues, I think is not true. For example, in 2011, when we first started gathering data, the amount of trips by outfitters on the Madison was less than, right around the 8,000 trips for the entire year across 160 some outfitters in 2011, and by 20 it has grown increasingly by about 5% a year to what we saw last year in 2021 at 18,000 trips. So it's grown by over 10,000 trips. The other part of that is all indicators that we have on non-commercial use has been increasing at twice the rate of the commercial use. So about 10% a year in non-commercial use using the estimators on the upper river. So the idea that the recommendations we proposed wouldn't fully address the crowding issues, I think is I understand the question, but it would certainly put a cap on the bottle and not allow, it would certainly not allow any further increase in trips across a year. And we have to start somewhere.
Okay. Thank you. Would anyone else like to add to that before we go to the next question? Okay.
Chair
Okay,
Robinson,
last question.
Oh, Commissioner Walsh.
just to interject, because I do feel pretty passionately about the methods of take and hazards to the fish in the particularly in the upper Madison, but we're seeing we have seen an increase in hook scarring, and it's estimated by the biologists in the department that 25+% of the fish now have hook scarring resulting from either ineffective release of the fish, using treble hooks, or who knows what.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Commissioner Walsh.
One thing our group talked about, and that is creating some recommended rules for the road that could be posted at launch sites and also reinforced by these new river ambassadors.
Okay. Let's go to the last question, and then we'll see if there's any questions that we haven't covered yet.
Thank you, Chair. Again, I think this one was covered a bit. Question 6, the committee recommended that passive data collection methods be implemented for counting river users that can result in a daily average level of use at different times of the year for the purpose of creating benchmark data that will aid in developing and implementing a comprehensive Madison River recreation plan. Is there any reason why this step would not precede all others? Several comments have been received that rather than executing a piecemeal implementation of components of a plan, wouldn't it be better off to focus on a comprehensive Madison River recreation plan?
Anyone want, Brian?
Yeah, I'll kind of just reiterate a few comments I made earlier that it's extremely important. Bozeman's the fastest growing. I think I have every hour I have another new neighbor in Bozeman. The statistics are astounding. We're on pace to be over 500,000 residents within 40 more years in Gallatin County. There's pressure is not going to stop coming to the Madison, and the non-commercial component is extremely important. And, essentially the question is, do we just hold everything and do everything at once, or do we have a tiered approach? And our recommendation is a tiered approach. We, as the commercial operators, we do tend to synchronize our rhythms. We tend to launch within about an hour and a half of each other. We tend to take off within about an hour and a half of each other. When we're all out there, it's within a similar time frame. And guides are pretty effective. It's their profession. They're good at catching fish. And I would say there's a lot of us that just sort of are really worried about the current pressure the river's been receiving. And we've seen furthermore dramatic growth from year to year to year. Mike Bias mentioned, the river has more than doubled in the last 10 years. We saw it go from just under 14,000 trips to 18,000 trips in a single year. And so the idea is, let's just sort of freeze what commercial use at the moment. There's a strong desire for the general public to see that. I think that gives us credibility. We see the need for it. And in a very short order, we do need a commitment that we're going to do something with non-commercial. We have to put a few steps in place. We have to have a permit system that's, and gather a little more data, but within 2 or 3 years, that needs to follow very shortly. But I think having that step forward by the commercial industry sets a good tone. It allows us to have a seat at the table. It allows, we're all worried about what we saw in the growth of the pandemic was troubling to many of us, and the quality is really starting. When you float 80 boats through one hole, and you're the 80th boat through trying to catch a fish on a hopper is pretty challenging, and we're starting to just erode that quality, and that's what we're worried about. That's why we're here.
Okay, I guess I have a little bit of a, so this has been going, it's been going on for several years. And so you guys talk a lot about the COVID increase in numbers, but so what was the big push several years ago?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that even before COVID, we were already worried. It was crowded before COVID, and then it's only increased to levels that, sometimes having to wait for an hour to get out of the boat in the ramp, and sometimes you're spending more time watching who's in front of you, who's behind you, and it's also cumulative when it comes to fishing. Even if you happen to go out really early in the morning, well, there were still 80 boats that floated through the day before, and a lot of those fish got caught. It's not just how many boats are around you at one time, it's how many boats have been down the river in the last month, or that whole season. Those fish get banged up, they get hook scars, they get really, really, really smart, and that all affects that quality of experience. So there was motivation. There was a reason all this started well before COVID. It was the same concern with just how many people can you put on one little ribbon of water and still have it be good. And I think COVID scared a lot of people because it was so abrupt, and the level of use we saw was so unacceptable to so many people. It really heightened the importance of doing something, and it really made people realize we're going to lose this experience if we don't do something.
Okay, hold on, Dan. I just want to go to Commissioner Byerth real quick.
This says, I think for either Dr. Bias or Brian, as I recall, back in 2019, the Fisheries Division actually proposed a non-commercial regulation, very similar to the committee's. So this has been part of the comprehensive planning process going back at least to 2019. And I know both Brian and Dr. Bias were engaged in earlier conversations. Maybe they can help me out with remembering the details on that. It's not like we just started the idea of a comprehensive plan. We've been working on it for many years, and they might remember better than me.
Thank you, Commissioner Byard. That's an excellent point. This has been going on for a while, and it started really, the first CAC was in 2011 and 2012, and FOAM was on that committee. And then in 2018, the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks actually put out the first EA to try and manage use, in particularly commercial use on the Madison. And then that the commission at that time, the EA was not accepted. And following that, with the decline in that EA, FOAM generated a petition, and we petitioned the commission to incorporate management options for commercial users. And also at that time, we recommended, based on Fish, Wildlife, and Parks recommendations, what we called at the time a Madison stamp. And so that was in 2019. And then subsequently in 2020, after public scoping and a lot of iterations, nothing was adopted. And we filed another petition in 2020, which actually led to a lot of what we're doing today. There was another point I was going to make, and that I got sidetracked with the numbers, so I'll come back. That's okay.
Sure. Dan, was there something you wanted to add to it?
I'll be very brief, but the history of trying to address the Madison River usage goes back at least a decade or more. And I know some people were talking about it far before the 2011 factor. And at least during my history, for the last 10 to 15 years, much of it was driven by perceived social issues, differences between wade fishermen, float fishermen, commercial, non-commercial, and it's just developed. What COVID did was just make the Madison River get loved even more so, as all of Montana was. We've seen the tourism impact and people moving here, and the Madison River is in a good example of that. And I think the other part of it is the Madison River is a world-class blue ribbon trout fishery, one of the famous rivers that people want to fish in their lifetime. And that is driving the business community, the commercial outfitters, and I think the non-commercial people to want to protect it.
I know, my point earlier, Dan, and that was a great summary, is that if you look at commercial use across COVID, commercial use actually declined in 2020 by several hundred trips. And then it wasn't until, and correspondingly, non-commercial use was tremendous, especially in the spring, because commercial users weren't allowed to operate. And then since then, we've caught up.
Yeah. All right. I thank you, Deb, for all the work that you've put into this, and thank you, the committee. And I know a lot of this, the questions that we went through at the end kind of, I think were helpful, because I know you guys had to repeat yourselves, but most of us are pretty new to this subject. And so it's the more we can understand it, the better. And I appreciate you guys taking the time going over it with us. And I just want to make sure, does anyone have any other questions that have come to your mind? All right.
And if I could just add, I think on behalf of work group members and certainly the subgroup, the devil's in the details. We've spent a lot of time in those details. Thank you for the opportunity to have this discussion. But I think if there's more questions as you dig in further, and you will be doing so, please use us as a resource.
Okay. I see that Chris Mcgrath from BLM, if you'd like to speak.
Yeah, hi. I just want to take a few minutes to say thank you all for listening to all of our, not sure what happened in the video there. Sorry, it kind of comes in and out. Thank you all for listening to all these recommendations. I was part of the 2011 committee group and have been very involved throughout this whole process. And a lot of these same questions that we're looking at today are the same ones that we were looking at in 2011. I think, as everyone said, COVID has definitely exacerbated some of the perceived concerns by both the public, the agencies, and the commercial users. And then I just wanted to announce that I have accepted another position, so I'll be leaving the committee. But we do have a couple other members of the BLM here today that will be filling that role. We have Eric London, who's our BLM River Ranger out of Ennis. He'll actually be detailing into my position for a while. We have Lacey Decker, who's our outdoor rec planner over in Dillon field office. And then we also have Amanda James, our field manager, is here today as well. So I just wanted to introduce them all to all of you.
Thank you.
Chair Robinson, if you would like, I can give you a very brief outline of our scoping plans. They're not solid yet, but if you'd like, I could provide that for you.
That would be great. Thank you.
So because the commission didn't think the comment period for the public was long enough, we are going to provide about a 60-day comment period. We're doing this so we could still meet the deadline to provide a summary to the commission at the December commission meeting. We'll be starting that public comment period next week or maybe the week after, but we will be ending it on about October 14th. And the reason we're picking October 14th is because our last public scoping meeting will be September 16th or September 14th. So we'll have about 30 days prior to the last meeting and 30 days after the last scoping meeting. Right now, the scoping meetings are scheduled for September. We realize that people are still out on the water in September, but we pushed it as far as we could to still allow for a lengthy public comment period. We will be having meetings in Bozeman on a meeting in Bozeman on September 6th, hopefully in Ennis on September 7th, West Yellowstone September 8th, and in Butte on September 13th. Then we will be having a Zoom meeting for any and all that want to attend. And also we'll be recording that and posting it to the website, and that'll be on September 14th. We haven't outlined the exact details of how these meetings will look like, primarily because I still want to talk to the commission members and get your input to help develop what you need from these meetings. So I'll be talking to you all next week to get some input. But we plan on having these meetings just be informational. We will not be recording public comment at these meetings. We will not have note takers. It will not be a hearing. We'll just be providing information and answer questions to the public. We will provide cards at the meetings to point people to the website, an email address, or a physical mailing address where they could submit comments. And at the request of Chair Robinson, we will also provide paper and ability to write down comments at those meetings if people wish to do so. So we'll be doing that. And that's really all we have right now. The meetings will be held in the evening as late as possible to accommodate people still out on the river. But recognizing we can't go till midnight. So it'll be a happy medium there. Does anybody have any questions?
Is there a time of day set for the Zoom meeting on the 14th?
It'll probably be about 6 to 8:30 p.m., same time as our in-person meetings.
Okay, thank you. Anyone have any questions? I like Deb said that it's not going to be recorded as far as the comments. So if anybody speaks to you about the meetings, just make sure that they know that they need to make official comments. And it's great to have them at the meetings, especially to understand everything and be able to comment in particular on items, but just make sure that they understand that they need to officially comment to get their comments. Yep, Dan.
Can you give us an idea of what material will be presented at these meetings or be available for people to review? We've inundated you guys with a lot of different materials. Are you condensing that down? What does that look like?
We're providing the public with everything that you have provided to the commission.
Oh,
so
okay.
All the recommendations, we will provide our staff assessment that FWP worked on, and several other materials. So the public will have everything. We'll have it electronically online that people could go to, and we'll also have handouts at the meetings.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right.
And that's all I have, Chair Robinson.
Thank you again for everything. And again, thank you for all the work that everyone's put into this. And if any of the commissioners have any questions after this Zoom meeting, I'm sure we could reach out to one or more of the members also for more clarification. And thanks, Commissioner Walsh and Commissioner Byerth, who's also attended a bunch of the meetings. So anything, Commissioner Walsh, would you like to say any closing remarks on this?
Yeah, I just want to thank the members of the work group again. They've just spent another 90 minutes of their life working on this issue, and the commitment that they've made on this public resource issue has just been outstanding. And I also want to thank Dan Larson for suggesting back at our commission meeting in June that we have this additional meeting to gather some more information from the work group. So thank you all, and thanks to the commissioners for your interest in this topic.
This meeting has been very helpful to me, and I understand things a lot better. And I really do appreciate it. So I think that's it, and everyone have a good evening.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.